Now, I am delighted to introduce Ross Holt, who is going to tell you a little bit about tonight's program and why we're having it and some other information that he knows. Thank you.
Just to let you know some of the things, the kind of things the Friends do. If you're sitting in a folding chair, those chairs were purchased with donations to the Friends of the Library. And if you're sitting in a green chair, plastic green chairs, those were purchased by the Asheboro Public Library Foundation. So we have a lot of strong supporters. Thank you, Linda. We do have a dual purpose here tonight. Certainly to hear from John McGlohon about witnessing one of the most momentous events in human history, but also to inaugurate a new collection of books and DVDs provided to the library through a major bequest. Last summer, a Randleman native named Margaret Cashatt Taylor passed away in Dearborn, Michigan. Ms. Taylor's husband, Robert C. Taylor Jr., predeceased her. In her estate, Ms. Taylor bequeathed her husband's outstanding collection of World War II books and DVDs to the library, along with a generous stipend to support and enhance the collection. That funding will allow us to increase the collection, expand the collection, as well as have programs like this and present speakers on topics related to World War II. The estate also arranged for us to accept Ms. Taylor's own collection of cooking and culinary arts books, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming months. We'll have some events related to those as well. The two collections included 315 World War II books, 116 World War II films, and 790 cookbooks and culinary books for a total of 1,221 items. They were shipped from Dearborn here by moving van. Louise Hudson, who is the retired Randleman librarian, said that some years ago, Ms. Taylor told her that when she passed, she would leave her collection of books to the library, and she made good on that vow. Ms. Taylor's sister, Kathy Hunt, is here tonight, and I would like to share our condolences with you on the loss of your sister and let you know how grateful we are that she considered us as one of the ways to let her husband's legacy and her own legacy live on. The books and DVDs from the Taylor collection, the ones we've added to the collection so far, are over here on the shelf tops, and they're available for checkout, so please take a look at them and enjoy them. I'll now call on Mayor David Smith to introduce our speaker, and he may have the most challenging task this evening of introducing someone who really needs no introduction. So, Mayor Smith, the challenge is yours.
Thank you, Ross. It is my pleasure to introduce someone who, to many of you, needs absolutely no introduction. John is a man who has given his life of service to the community as a volunteer firefighter, as an innovative fire chief, as a member of the city council for 18 years. He was born in Guilford County in 1923. His family moved him to Asheboro when he was 6 months old, and they lived on the corner of Hoover and Church Street, right across from what is the City Hall. And the original City Hall was right there also. They tore that building down to build the City Hall that we have now. And behind their house was a little stable, livery stable. And as a child, John earned candy by helping rub the horses down at the stables. He attended Fayetteville Street School, which many of you remember was right over here on Fayetteville Street, right there across from the Advance Auto. And prior to that, I think that was an A&P store, A&P grocery store. And he told me he carried the Charlotte Observer as a young man. He had it for 3 years. He delivered papers, the Charlotte Observer. And his route was the only route in town, and he carried from Asheboro Plumbing down there right at the bypass on Sunset, down to right below the high school where 64 crosses at Stedman's, over to Clyde Lucas's house up here on Worth Street, the very dead end of Worth Street, and up past the hospital. So, that was quite a route. I was amazed that the route was that big. And he said he did that on foot, except for 6 months when he had a bicycle, 6 weeks, I think he said, when he had a bicycle. He loaned his bicycle to somebody and it got run over, so he was back on foot. A week before he turned 18, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Once he did his basic training, a series of different jobs, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that tonight, how he ended up as a reconnaissance photographer in the military. And I hope he gets to tell you how many different theaters and deployments he had. He was all over the world. Doing what he did, he could be there for 6 months and then move on somewhere else. After the war, he returned to Asheboro. He married Jane Gilback. Many of you know his wife Jane, knew his wife Jane. And his brother-in-law, David Gilback, together they started John David Photography here in Asheboro. And that was a natural because of what he did. I've got some pictures right up here on the front that he took of scenes of Asheboro in the late 40s when they had John David Photography. The Randolph room has a large collection of John David Photography pictures, but the Chamber of Commerce probably has possibly the largest collection. They have hundreds of pictures that John and his brother-in-law took in the 40s and 50s, and some of them are right here on the table. Before you come up and see those afterwards. The photography business began to fail when department stores started doing photography and drugstores started doing mail order photography, and everybody could afford a camera. At that point, John took a couple of different jobs around town, but during that time he was a volunteer fireman. And Chief Clarence Rush talked him into applying to be a full-time fireman, and he was the only the sixth full-time fireman hired in the city of Asheboro. In 1961, he succeeded Chief Rush as only the third chief in the history of Asheboro Fire Department. By the time he retired as chief in 1985, there were 36 employees. He was responsible for the new fire station on Church Street and the new fire station in North Asheboro. He implemented training and fire protection programs, brought fire safety lessons to the school children, and after retirement he served 18 years on the Asheboro City Council. He retired in 2005 from that elected position, and he was the first recipient of the key to the city of Asheboro. It is, as Tom Brokaw said, called this the greatest generation. John is truly a member of the greatest generation, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you a true Asheboro treasure, my friend John McGlohon.
I was expecting 25 people. I'm sure somebody told you Elvis was going to be here. But I do appreciate you taking your time to come out to hear an old man ramble. Because what I've got to talk about tonight happened 71 years ago. And unfortunately, I'm the last person on earth that can tell you the story. I hope you won't be bored. I joined the Air Force on my 18th birthday, was sent immediately down to Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. There I went through boot camp, and with nothing but good luck. I have been lucky all my life. With luck, I was assigned directly from boot camp to the 3rd Photo Mapping Squadron. In January of 1942, the squadron moved from Maxwell Field, Alabama, down to McGill Field, Florida. And from there, over the next 2.5 years, they were deployed on 3 rather amazing missions, and I was lucky enough to take part in each of those. Our first mission went to South America, where we mapped the east coast of South America, mapping the air routes for future airplanes that would be on their way to Africa by the southern route. We flew twin-engine C-45s. We flew with the pilot and the photographer. It was short flights, but it was in some very uncomfortable positions. With that mission complete, we returned to the States, and not too long after that, our next deployment took us to Alaska. This time we were supplied with North American B-25s, and instead of a 2-man crew, we now had a 5-man crew. We went to Alaska and we mapped what is now the Alcan Highway, up through Canada and Alaska. While we were there, we mapped the entire state of Alaska, including the Aleutian Islands. That was the most interesting, some beautiful country up there. The third deployment carried us a little further. We switched again from the B-25 to the consolidated B-24, and now we picked up a 9-man crew, and we went the southern route that we had mapped out before. We went to Natal, Brazil, across to the Ascension Islands, across Africa, and into India. Is this coming through all right?
Yes.
Across and into the city of Gushkara in India. And from there, we mapped what is referred to as the hump, the air routes over the Himalaya mountains, from the Assam Valley over to Kunming in China. You can imagine what it's like to be flying across there with Mount Everest sitting off your wingtip. Rough country. But with those 3 deployments, we returned to the States, and we were moved from MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida, out to Smoky Hill Air Force Base in Salina, Kansas. And there we were preparing for our next deployment, which would be the islands in the Pacific once they were secured. We were doing practice for long-range missions. We were using small B-17s and flying 12, 14 hours just to get used to being in the air a while. We were waiting to accept the B-29, the best airplane that we had at the time. It was just coming off the assembly line, and we were transitioning for that. The B-29, once configured for reconnaissance, was referred to as an F-13. So if I mix up 29s and 13s, you'll know why. Before the squadron could leave for the Pacific, we got a request from the commanding general in China that he needed additional reconnaissance. So out of the 3rd Photo Squadron, 4 crews were chosen to go back to China. We took brand new B-29s. Ours was the 6th one that came out of the factory in Wichita. And with the 4 crews, we went right back over the same routes we had come, back to South America, over across the ocean, across Africa. Instead of stopping in India, we ended up this time in the village of Xinqing, which was just out of the city of Shantou in China. From there, our mission was to map and recon the east coast of China, out across the Shantung Peninsula, up as far north as Mukden, Manchuria, and on one occasion we were inside of Vladivostok, Russia. On our return trip to our base, we'd fly down the Korean Peninsula and map that, and then across the Yellow Sea, doing sea search and looking for Japanese shipping, both military and mercantile. We realized at that time that We were photographing airfields that had fighter planes on the ground, and they were not making any effort to come up to meet us. So we felt that the Japanese supply lines were depleted and they had nothing to fly with. With that in mind, the command in China released us, and we were diverted from the city of Xinjiang down to the island of Guam in the Marianas. There we rejoined the unit that we had left in Salina, Kansas. We were stationed at Harmon Field in Agana on Guam, and there the airport, the topography was such that we could not take a fully loaded B-29 off the ground and take it to the islands. So if we had a mission set for tomorrow morning, we would fly up the afternoon before, fly up about 12 miles to Northfield. There we would load the gas, the ammunition, the cameras, check the airplane out, put a guard on it, and they would truck us back down to Agana. We'd get our supper, go to bed for a couple of hours, be awakened again about 2 o'clock in the morning, fed breakfast, truck back to Northfield. Once we pre-flight the airplane there, we would take off of the field at Northfield. And when you took off there, as you went off the end of the runway, you were already airborne. You went right off the cliffs out over the ocean. Our normal flight would have been that we would have flown at low altitude until we were within about an hour of the homeland. At that time, we would start climbing for altitude that had been assigned to us for that day. And we'd put on our flak suits, get our oxygen bottle. The B-29 was pressurized. Fortunately, we did not have to wear an oxygen mask all the time, but you had to have some ability in case of an emergency and it deflated. So we put on our flak suits, which consisted of heavy armor plating, chest and back, a helmet that was metal. It looked like a football helmet, because the minute we crossed the islands, we knew we were going to be shot at. Being a lone airplane, the Japanese fighters seldom approached us, but the anti-aircraft fire never ceased. Sometimes it looked like you could get out and walk on it. But we would just make our assigned flight for that day. It might be 12 hours, it might be 16 hours. When we got back to Guam late in the afternoon, it was my job to take the lab that we had done that day and take it over to the lab. Leave it in the lab, I'd go back to the barracks, and we were through until our next assignment. So that was normal. We maybe flew twice a week. On the morning of August the 6th, 1945, it was no different from us. On the 5th, we went over, flew the plane up to Northfield, loaded it up, checked it out, went back to our barracks, went to bed, got up, we'll haul back over to Northfield, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, we rolled off the end of the runway out over the Pacific. We followed the same pattern that we normally would have. As we approached the home islands, we climbed the altitude, which that day was, I think, assigned at about 25,000 feet. And we crossed over to homeland somewhere around 8:30. I've never been sure of the exact time. As we approached the city of Hiroshima, one of the gunners just called over the intercom. He said, somebody's headed for Iwo. So Iwo Jima was the nearest emergency airfield. And it was not unusual to see if there was a plane out in front, a bomb strike, another reconnaissance plane, that if they had problems, They would salvo their bomb load to light the plane, and they would try to make it to Hiroshima. So it wasn't unusual that he had seen another plane. But shortly thereafter, and we could never decide among ourselves whether it was 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or a minute and a half, but in a short period of time after this remark over the intercom, there was a brilliant white flash directly below us and around us. It was something we'd never seen before. We saw towns burning every day, but we had never seen anything. It was just as if somebody had fired a great big flash bullet right in your eyes. The pilots, the gunners out in the blister, the pilot up in the front were temporarily blinded. I learned later that the inaugurated crew had goggles and gloves to protect them from radiation and so forth. Our crew had nothing. My only vision from my position in the B-29 was through a 12-inch glass directly between my feet and the bottom of the airplane. So the only way I could see out of the airplane was to look straight down. And when my eyes adjusted to this flash, what I saw was a humongous cloud just rolling up at us. It was so different from anything that we had ever seen. I assumed that that airplane that we had seen had salvoed his bomb load and hidden ammunition dump. And I didn't want him to be disappointed, so I reached over and turned on my cameras so that I could record his good hit. Once I turned the cameras on, they were automatic. They ran until I cut them off. So I don't know how long I sat there, but the boys up in the gunnery compartment, I could hear them chattering about it, telling me what they were seeing. So I picked up a handheld 4x5 camera, walked up into the gunnery compartment, and took pictures of the cloud that was now several thousand foot above our altitude. This wasn't part of our flight plan for the day, so the pilots and the navigators continued right on. We just flew on off. Our lines that day took us over the northern island of Hokkaido, and we were up there. We got back to Guam. It was about 4:30. My flight log says we flew 15 hours and 15 minutes that day. We got to Guam. I loaded the film in the Jeep and carried it to the lab. A little strange because when I got there were Marine guards on the gate or on the door. And they said, well, just put your film over there in the corner. I dropped it over in the corner and walked on into the lab. And in the plotting room.
Just going to get it closer to you, that's all.
All right.
Make it easier for them to hear in the back.
Good deal. Is that better?
A little bit?
I'm getting a little feedback. I hope you're not. But when I walked through the lab, Sergeant Johnny Dornblazer was running a roll of film across the plotting board to caption it. Now, a roll of our film was about 35 millimeter. A roll of our film was 9.5 inches wide and 500 foot long. So we handled it with rollers. And he was rolling this film across the plotting board, and as I looked over his shoulder on a 9x9 negative, there was a little profile cloud, a picture of that cloud. It was about maybe an inch and a half high on that 9x9 negative. I asked Johnny Dornblazer, I said, Johnny, what is that? He said, that's an atomic bomb. Jokingly, I said, well, if it is, we took portraits this morning. And a voice behind me said, if you did, you'll be dead in the morning. So that was my first knowledge of an atomic bomb. Fortunately, the radiation didn't reach us. We didn't go through the cloud. We were above it. We were out of there before it got up. And I've often wondered what happened to that radiation anyway, because when we left Guam, they said nobody will ever live in Hiroshima for 100 years. If you look it up now on the net, you'll find it looks like Las Vegas. So I don't know what happened to the radiation, but fortunately we did not get any that day. But I left the lab, I didn't see the pictures. Once I had told them that we had taken them, the lab crew started going through trying to find mine so that they could check to see if we were lying. You know, this was August 6th. On the 9th, they bombed Nagasaki. September the 2nd, the Japanese surrendered. On October the 5th, I was a civilian here in Asheboro. They got rid of me so quick that I didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to the crew. I sat here and told the story. I told my family, and I guess the word got out. The newspapers picked it up that we had seen this happen. I got a chance to speak to a lot of people, but I often wondered, where did that picture, that film that I saw, where did it come from? Because the 509th Bomb Group that carried out the bombing, and bless their hearts, it's a job that could never be done again. They did a great job, but it was so secretive that they had every plane involved with them positioned. So I knew none of them could have taken that roll of film, but I had no idea where it came from. For 50 years, I did not have any contact with any of my crew or anyone else. I just told the story. I knew some people didn't believe it, and I didn't care. I knew what it was. I could take it or leave it. Picked up the phone one day, and my wife handed me the phone and said, Mr. Herman wants to speak to you. And when I heard his voice, I said, Bob, where are you? He was my flight engineer on the last crew. He said, I'm in Hutchinson, Kansas. Said the squadron has had a reunion in Colorado Springs last year, and said we're having another one 2 weeks from now down in Tampa, Florida. I said, we'll be there. So my wife and son drove down to Tampa, checked into the hotel, and I immediately went to the hospitality room, hoping to see some of my crew or some of the fellows that I remembered. But as I walked into the hospitality room, I don't think it was quite as big as this, but across the display in the back of the room, Lieutenant Elbert Dixon, one of our lab officers, had absconded with a bunch of pictures when he was discharged, many of them still labeled top secret. And he had brought these as a display and had them across. And as I walked into the room, I saw on the top of the thing, I told my wife, that's the picture I took. It was exactly as I saw it in my ground glass coming up at us. I walked across the room and read the label, and as it shows on the picture downstairs, it said Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. So I knew then that it was the picture that we had taken. Still had no idea how we got there, why we were there. And once we started having annual reunions, and at one time 5 of the crew members were still living and we were all together, and we just asked ourselves why. The operations officer that had sent us out that morning retired as a colonel, and he was with us. He said, I did not know anything about the atomic bomb any more than you did. My pilot died thinking maybe we were guinea pigs. If we got back, we could tell about it. If we didn't, no one would ever know what happened. But in talking to the operations officer, he straightened out one thing. He said 2 weeks before the bombing, General LeMay requested 2 aircraft crews from our squadron to be sent up to Tinian to be indoctrinated by the 509th and fly under their direction. So Captain Omar Cox and Lieutenant Tom Kendall's crew were sent up, and the colonel was told, when you send the crew up, send their names, and nobody can be changed once they're here. It was such a secretive mission, and they weren't sure that the mission would be completed, that those crews might not get back. But that morning, Lieutenant Kendall's crew aborted and didn't get off. But Omar Cox's crew, interviews with them much later, said that they were told to stay 50 miles away from the target area. They were to trail the Enola Gay by 15 minutes. When they saw the result of the bombing, they were to photograph it and return immediately to Guam. That's how they had gotten back to Guam, and the film had been processed before we got back. So that satisfied my memory there. There's still a lot of questions I don't know. And as I spoke to groups around the country, had a fire chief friend who'd been a gunner on the B-24. He was fire chief up at Reedsville, John Monsee's chief. He invited me to come up to speak to a veterans group up in Madison. While I was there was a gentleman who at that time was doing interviews of veterans for the State Museum. And after my talk there, he called me and wanted to know if he could come down and make a tape of my interview, which we did. And he and I got to be real good friends. A few weeks, months, or maybe a year or two later, he moved over to Farrington Village. And they were organizing a new group over there, and he asked me to come over and speak to that group. So I agreed to go. But somebody, as he got out publicity about it, somebody contacted someone they must have known in the 509th Association. The 509th Association was still very active in that they were holding reunions every year, selling pictures and autographs of everything that they had done. But whoever they contacted sent him an email and said, no, said, we never heard of him. Said he's just some punk trying to make a name for himself. I sent him an email and said, you might at least check the story before you start bad-mouthing somebody. And I got the nastiest email back. He said, why don't you quit telling your fairy tale? He said, you're going to end up in prison. So I'll come down there and debate you anytime. I didn't know nothing to debate him with. But I sent him an email and said, life's too short to argue with a moron. It turns out that he was not even a member of the 509th. He was an honorary member of the 509th because he had worked his way up by helping to hold their reunions. But unfortunately, I haven't heard from him since. But the result of that, the gentleman that I had invited me spent the next 3 years researching the story. He talked to every living person that could have any input into how we got there, why we were there. He stacked up records of every flight. He proved the difference. That picture has Omar Cox's flight number on it, not ours. But he found that my film, once they went through and got my film, they just commingled it with Omar Cox's film. Colonel Becker said he flew pictures up to General LeMay up on Tinian at 10 o'clock the night after we got back. Said they wouldn't even let him see it. I have often wondered, I'd like to see the face on the intelligence officers that were expecting to find a little profile cloud when they went into the film and looked down on the docks of Hiroshima with the cloud coming up out of them. I'm sure they said, where did that come from? Because they had proved none of their planes could be there. So when he released this, when Ken Samuelson down at Pittsburgh released this to Channel 5 and Raleigh, it hit the national news and it went worldwide. So the story's out there. If you want to read the whole thing, all you got to do is put my name in Yahoo and scroll down to Right On New Jersey, and there's 17 pages of my rambling. But I was glad that at least we had proof as to why we were there. I think it was purely incidental. I think it was very accidental that we went over the top of it at just the right time. I wrote up a little deal and called it When Seconds Make the Difference. If we'd have been 10 seconds later, we'd have flown through the top of that cloud. Whether the radiation would have been there or not, no one can tell. Fortunately, we went over the top, we went out into clear airspace, and we were gone. I had 4.5 years. I was very fortunate. I lost a brother and a lot of good friends. But I was one of the lucky ones. But my aunt's washwoman's sister's son had a policeman on his beat say to a laborer on the street that he had a letter just last week, written in Latin or maybe Greek, from a Chinese coolie in Timbuktu who said that the ignorant Cuban knew of a colored man in a Texas town who got it straight from a circus clown, that a man in Klondike heard the news from a gang of South American Jews about some fellow in Borneo who heard of a man who claimed to know of a swell society female fake whose mother-in-law would undertake to prove that her seventh husband's niece had stated in a printed piece that she has a son who has a friend who knows how this thing's going to end. Thank you. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, if John has agreed to answer a couple of questions from the audience. If anybody has a question, we'll try to entertain a couple.
Once you finish assigning a jacket. So.
That's right. Mr. Hodge.
Both missions, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, were made up of 3 planes. The bomber, a scientific plane, and a photo plane. On Nagasaki, there was only 2 planes that made all the way in. Did the photo plane make it all the way in, or did the scientific plane?
I don't know. I knew nothing about the deal at Nagasaki.
So you don't know. So I know that on the Nagasaki, there were only 2 planes. Nagasaki was almost
I don't.
blown up there.
I'm not sure that we had. I've never heard Colonel Becker say that we sent any planes back and forth. Once they saw our result, they knew that planes could get in closer.
Right.
So they made it.
A little bit easier.
Once they saw our pictures, and many of the pictures you see printed that say they're Hiroshima pictures were actually taken in Nagasaki, because they knew then they could get in closer and whether or not any of our aircraft were there.
By the way, your picture is in a set of books that were donated to the museum. I went through that. It's a photo history of the. Well, I don't know how many books is in that thing, but there's a photo history. But your picture is in there.
Yeah, it's been in a lot of places. The original print is in a little museum in Tyler, Texas, because the lieutenant that had the display across the board, when he died, his wife gave all of his collection to a small museum in Tyler, Texas. While my friend was researching this, he called and talked to the director down there and asked him about the picture, and the fellow said, I don't know, what you talking about? He said, well, do you realize that you have the original copy of the only picture taken directly down on top? He said, no, I didn't know we had it. I said, well, so it's been used a lot. Ever since it hit the National, I've had a lot of kids write wanting an autograph. They'll send a little postcard with a drawing of the cloud and say, will you sign this? I've tried to make it a point to make them a print, sign it, and send them a picture of my original picture. I had one kid in Seattle, Washington, I think was making a business of it. I begin to get a request about once every 2 weeks. But I've tried I'm just tickled to death to have kids still interested. So I've tried to give them a print if they did.
Anybody else have a question?
It's amazing what you went through, John. I live in a place at Piedmont Crossing in Thomasville, and I was instrumental in doing some World War II recordings, and they're out at the Hall of Fame Museum now. One of the fellows there flew in a B-24 and came across at about the time, and you talk about the secrecy. He knew nothing about it other than the fact that he saw the big cloud mushroom come up in the B-24 after raid in Tokyo, because they were doing that at the same time the folks were bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the last comment I want to make, I hope it's not the last. What was the name of your aircraft that you were flying in?
The 509th did a job that could never be done again. It was carried out from beginning to end, very secretive. And today, with the news media where it is, it could not be done again.
What was the name of your aircraft?
We did not have a name. My pilot doesn't like names on aircraft. He frankly put the wrong picture on it.
We're calling the unknown.
It's the top center picture, the one straight down over the cloud.
This one, right? He said, is this the
Yeah,
one
that's
straight down?
the picture. You'll notice Hiroshima, and here's the flight number up in the corner. This is the harbor section, and this is the cloud coming up. I've always talking about it, said we didn't get the atomic cloud. We got it looking like you were looking on top of an open umbrella. So that's kind of the effect when you're looking straight down on it. This is the result. That's a post strike. I didn't know those were behind me. That was some crew. A pilot, navigator, flight engineer, navigator, radio operator. I don't know that fellow. He's one of the gunners, our crew chief. This is the last boy to die. Bill Wheeler was our tail gunner. You can imagine back in the back of that B-29, all by himself, once we got off and got pressurized, he was back there for 14 hours by himself. But before the war, Bill had been a junk dealer in Brooklyn. When we'd fly over places and we'd start getting anti-aircraft fire, I could look down and see every gun fire. You just see I'd call over the intercom and say, 8 rounds coming up. I want them to be prepared when the stuff started popping off the side. Bill would sit back in the back and start singing, "It all comes back to me now." So that was a good curve.
Sir.
I spent 14 years in the Air Force, 5 of the years nuclear security.
So you go ahead.
Mission on Hiroshima, there actually were 7 aircraft on this mission. And one was taking photos, one rock sensors. There was a bomber, a piece of 29 went ahead to the inaugurated to do reconnaissance, to make sure the target area was clear of cloud cover. But my question is, now, since y'all were not carrying bombs, in a lot of these missions, even the inaugurated was very heavily overloaded. My understanding is that the B-29s had a lot of problems because they were so rushed into production before a lot of testing was done.
Of course, I know you gave us reconfigured the bomb bay because that was one bomb. So,
my understanding is that a lot of times the B-29s,
we carried extra gas tanks in our bomb bay. We never carried bombs. That's how we could make 16-hour flights. We used extra bomb bay tanks. Yeah. So, we saw it first, and we were some of the last people in the civilized world to know what it was.
Did you ever ditch?
Never ditched. Thank goodness. No, we had a lot of planes, those things don't float very well. They're not like the Miracle in the Hudson where Swally floated that one. Going off the cliffs at North Field, it was about a 300-foot drop right under the water. One night we had aborted a mission and we pulled off between the runways. We'd gotten out of our airplane and I was talking to my CFC gunner. And he said the strike was going out, and that was just one right behind the other. He said if one of those didn't make it, he said, I'd just faint. And the next plane that came down the runway never left the ground. He went off and disappeared in the ocean. I looked around and he was up to himself. He passed out. But those things didn't float.
Thank you for coming. We enjoyed it. And I noticed on the day, the 6th, our press today, our papers, they don't remember. A lot of people forgetting. There was nothing in the Greensboro, there was nothing in the Courier about it. Nothing. Did y'all see anything?
It wasn't mentioned.
Nothing. They've done that over the last few years,
Yeah.
I guess it's not politically correct.
Japan is also, it's not even taught in schools there.
But we need to remember history, not forget it.
Yeah. Amen.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
John, there's some water for you.
Yeah. There you go.
Thank you so much.
Right.